Sweet. People are still joining us, trickling in, but I'm just going to get started here because we have a full presentation from Chris Looney today on a good news story, which is rare in the invasive species field. So really looking forward to this presentation by Chris. It's on the from introduction to eradication, the mortar hoarder and Saga in the Pacific Northwest. So should be a very informative, eye-opening, and happy story coming out of from our neighbors in the United States. Tuning in from Washington, I'm happy to introduce Chris Looney. Chris received a master's in entomology from Washington State University in 2000 and a PhD in environmental science from the University of Idaho. He became interested in insects as an undergraduate when he realized that there are so many different species that he would never have to work on the same one twice. His graduate work documented insect biodiversity at the Hanford Site and on the Palouse in Washington State. After a stint as a fish biologist in Idaho and under the Customs and Border Protection agent in Washington, he joined the Washington State Department of Agriculture and now manages the WSDA Entomology Laboratory in Olympia, Washington. The lab provides identification services for Washington stakeholders, supports exotic pest surveys across the state, and conducts research on exotic insect species and their native relatives. Current lab projects include research on how exotic pest traps impact bee populations, the impacts of Bombus impatiens in Cascadia, the biology of giant hornets, and whatever other random things pop up throughout the year. So recently in the news, the northern giant hornet was eradicated from the US after 5 years of hard work. And for the next 45 minutes or so, Chris will highlight the challenges, innovative approaches, and collaborative efforts that led to this rare invasive species victory. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Chris, I'm going to pass things over to you. Thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'll give you a moment to enjoy the beauty of this large stinging wasp as she cleans the grime from her legs and back after recently emerging from the pupal stage. And yeah, that's enough of that. All right, so I'd like to talk to you today about how we eradicated or really prevented the establishment, is how I like to think about it, of a giant apex insect predator from North America, really, Washington State and adjacent British Columbia. I'm happy to be presenting on behalf of all of the people in this title slide, any one of whom could probably give this talk, could definitely give this talk. And just to sort of set the stage about how this is different and unique, maybe from some of the other eradication efforts you've heard of. Perhaps you read in the news that South Africa is about to embark on a major eradication of house mice from an island that's important for shorebird or seabird nesting. That's going to involve like helicopters and boats and massive applications of rodenticide, lots of monitoring and years in effort. The work we're talking about today was much more low key in the sense that there were no helicopters and no massive applications of any kind of insecticide. But it still took an enormous amount of work and really a lot of different kinds of parts of the community and support from the public and support from government and funding to really talk about an animal and keep an animal from establishing that was completely different than rodenticides. And we had no small amount of luck involved in this project as well. So this is a model for maybe how some eradication campaigns could go. It's totally inappropriate to other ones, such as mice on rocky islands. And all right, so sit back and let's see how this all happened. Okay, so the insect we're talking about first is Vespa mandarinia, Smith described in 1852. This is an insect that is very prominent in its native range. It's large and thus has like common names, for instance, in every basically culture that it exists. O Suzumibache in Japan, which means sort of the giant sparrow bee. If you look in English common names in the literature, it kind of bounced around between giant hornet, Asian giant hornet, Japanese giant hornet, etc. The Entomological Society of Canada and the Entomological Society of the United States or of America have adopted the name northern giant hornet, partially to make it easy or hard to confuse it with other hornets, all of which come from Asia. So the name Asian isn't really in here anymore because that's just confusing and not very informative. And then the northern bit distinguishes it from um, distinguishes it from a southern relative that I'll tell you briefly about in a while, the southern giant hornet. But really, I'm going to probably say giant hornet. And also, I quite like the name murder hornet. It rolls off the tongue, but it falls afoul of Entomological Society guidelines. So, northern giant hornet is Vespa mandarinia, the northern giant hornet. And it, yeah, okay. So, I'll walk us through some basic aspects of the life cycle and what we know about this insect because they are really relevant to how we were able to conduct the eradication campaign. It is in the group Hymenoptera, so that's bees, wasps, ants, honeybees, sawflies, if you know what those are. So like relatively highly evolved insects, if you will, that are quite diverse, includes parasitoids as well. More specifically, it is the in the nominative genus for the family Vespidae. That's 5,000 or so species worldwide, and they include things that we all know and love, like yellow jackets and paper wasps. Most of the species in the family are carnivores. There's a couple of cool things like these pollen wasps that actually feed only on pollen, as the name suggests, but they're the odd bug out. Most of the animals in here feed on other insects or carrion or whatever they can as an intrinsic part of their life cycle. The genus Vespa specifically is the group of 22 or so species in the world that house the giant hornets. None of these are native to North America. They are all native to Asia, and then there are two species that also range into Europe. So there's essentially 20 Asian species and 22 and two more Eurasian species. We do have a Vespa representative in North America, the European hornet. This is a good example of why geographic common names can be misleading. The European hornet, in fact, exists from its native range is from Ireland to Japan, so truly Eurasian. Anyway, that was established in maybe New Jersey or New York. I can't quite remember, more than 100 years ago, and now it's kind of found throughout the maritime provinces and in the states and provinces to about the Great Plains, and then it peters out. So our only Vespa in North America, no native Vespa at all. The animal, the sobriquet, is truly deserved. It is a giant insect. Here is a Vespa mandarinia queen, sort of in the upper right of your screen, arrayed against a series of insects that are native to the Pacific Northwest, so British Columbia and Washington State, and then one of these European hornets from back east. And you can see that even in the cases where the other insects are maybe as long as she is, they have nowhere near the amount of girth. These are truly, for the world of insects, quite large. They are giant hornets. Native range is sorted throughout East Asia, from northern Russia through Japan, South Korea, all across China, and into Southeast mainland or the Indochine Peninsula. And then they range further west along the Himalayas, but really only up in the mountains. And that is because the species is generally a temperate to subtropical species. Once it gets really, really hot into the tropics, it vanishes and it becomes replaced there by the southern giant hornet, Vespa soror, a sister species whose biology is in almost every way identical. And really, they just have slightly different environmental needs, slightly overlapping niches, but distinct. And yeah, that's it. This is where it's known from. These are data from iNaturalist, which has become a really useful way to think about where species are. Before, if you had looked at old GBIF data right when we started, it made it seem like the species was only in Japan and South Korea and maybe one or two bits in China. But with modern data, we know that it's basically everywhere. It's very common. I'm going to walk us through the colony cycle of the hornet. It's important for understanding how our eradication project worked. We were able to take advantage of aspects of its life cycle. I'm starting arbitrarily where we are right now in the life cycle, which is the end of hibernation when mated and unmated gines are emerging from their overwintering sites. So in social Hymenoptera, which this is a species of social Hymenoptera, meaning that there's one or a few reproducing animals in the nest. There are many, many sterile workers that sort of do all the colony work, cleaning, rearing, defending the nest, etc. And then at the end of the season, they produce new reproductives. So a gine in the parlance of social Hymenoptera is a hornet or a wasp or a yellow jacket that could be reproductive. If they mate and found a colony, they become a queen. If they don't, they're just a gine. Anyway, so we're in the part of the year where the mated gines or mated and unmated gines would be emerging from their hibernation. If they are mated, that instigates this behavior where they search out a colony site for this species. It's usually a hole in the ground, but some sort of protected area where she can establish a colony. And she does exactly that. She will find a place, sort of excavate the space, so that's sufficient for the initial comb she will create. She'll chew up some wood, turn that into paper, create your stereotypical sort of wasp comb, maybe 40-ish or so cells, lay some eggs, and during this time she has to come and go from the nest quite a lot to capture the insects that then she will then feed to her larvae. The larvae are predators, or yeah, not predators, but carnivores, and but they don't have legs or wings, so somebody else has to bring them the food, and that's what the queen does. So this is a pretty sensitive time in the colony cycle. She could easily be trod upon by a human, or hit by a car, or eaten by a bear, or something like that. And so there's a lot of colony failure at this delicate stage. The unmated giants, they do not have these kind of behaviors. They just sort of zip around on the landscape. They feed on carbohydrates, so sap or fruit, and eventually peter out. So that instant initial colony establishment behavior of the queen continues until about her first brood, or until her first brood emerges. So again, 40 or so workers. Once that occurs, they start doing all of the tasks. They get the paper pulp to expand the combs. They do the hunting for the larvae. They clean out and excavate the nest as it expands, and they also, relevant to us, come out and sting you if you interfere with the nest. And the queen at this point sort of just stays in the nest and lays eggs. And again, she's the only one in the colony that can really lay eggs, certainly the only one that can lay fertile eggs. So colony growth sort of continues throughout the season, sort of slowly expands. The workers are hunting in this particular species just about anything. They can get their mandibles on: beetles, wasps, cicadas, and you'll start to see them sometimes at beehives during this time, catching individual bees and then bringing back to the nest and feeding the larvae. Later on in the season, as you get to the maximum sort of colony size, that colony then begins to produce the new giants and males. So they start creating larger cells, and many of those eggs are now destined to become reproductives, no longer workers. And this is where you begin to see a really unique behavior for this species and Vespa soror, its sister species, and the one that got everybody worked up about it when it showed up in North America. And that is this group predation behavior on other social Hymenoptera. We'll come back to that in a minute, but it's this fascinating behavior where they will, as several workers at the same time, will attack another social Hymenoptera nest, essentially eliminate all the defensive members, so no more workers. And then at that point, they will predate on larvae and bring them back to their nest, sort of ad libitum. And again, that only occurs late in the season. It's not exactly clear why. That does correlate when there's this push to grow the new giants and the males. That also could be late in the season when there's not many other insects on the landscape at large, except for these nests of other social Hymenoptera. So, but they co-occur. Once those new giants and males emerge, they essentially will mate. Some giants will mate, some will not, and then they disperse and go to their overwintering sites. The nests for this species aren't the biggest in the genus. There are some nests that are some species that are much larger, but even so, a single nest of Vespa mandarinia can easily produce 300 potential new queens. That's kind of a lot of animals. But that doesn't happen until the very end of the life cycle. So essentially, between here and here, the colony is in a completely non-reproductive state. And that's when it is most sensitive to, or most important for us to eradicate it. Let's see. And then we don't actually know much about dispersal of Vespa mandarinia. We have no idea how far they fly. We've done some experiments actually with this that are still being worked on that come up with some theoretical limits, and it seems to be quite far. But we do know related Vespa, other hornet species, can easily travel 28 kilometers from their nest after they emerge. So they can get around. Basically, at this point, once the giants and the males start emerging, the nest just dies off. The workers begin to die, the males die. Any late emerging giants die because there's nobody there to take care of them, so they don't get enough carbohydrates, and they sort of die in the nest. And then the nest is taken over by parasites like wax moths and raccoons, whatever. It is over. And then those mated and unmated giants overwinter somewhere in the soil or sheltered areas. This is essentially the exact same life cycle you would see for a yellow jacket in the northern hemisphere. So all those wood you bring in from your wood pile, and then suddenly you have yellow jackets flying around. Those are overwintering giants as well. So single year life cycle with reproduction really only occurring at the end in the fall. Talk briefly about nests. This species almost always nests in some kind of cavity. Well, it actually always nests in some sort of cavity. It is usually underground, either in like some rotten conifer root spaces, trunk hollows, or rodent burrows. Very rarely, they can be recorded in hollow trees above ground, and even more rarely in human structures. But that would be alarming. This is, in fact, a picture of a giant hornet nest in above somebody's bathroom in Korea, which would have to be one of the worst things you can imagine having in your bathroom. And you can see all the workers in here hanging out on the comb and taking care of larvae. And this is a picture of a nest that was excavated actually in Nanaimo, British Columbia. And the nest can be quite large, couple feet wide, and again, hundreds and hundreds of hornets. The species feeds on two main kind of food groups, if you want to think about it that way: queens and workers. So the adult hornets exclusively feed on liquids, the liquid diet, and they will forage for carbohydrates like sap or fruit when they're out at large. They will also be foraging for larvae or other insects to bring back and feed their larvae. So the prey that they need to feed the larvae, which are the carnivores. They will forage again pretty far from nests, several kilometers, but usually they'll stick close to home, because why waste the energy flying far when you have food right across the street? And listen to this for a second. Hopefully you can hear that little scratchy noise. So these are larvae in a nest, and they presumably are scraping the walls of the nest to alert, I'll turn the sound down, to alert the workers that they need to be fed. And they're going to be fed then the insects that the workers went out and captured. And then the larvae in turn will actually regurgitate a mixture of amino acids and carbohydrates. They puke it up, and the workers will feed on that from the larvae. This is a trophallaxis. It's a common behavior in Hymenoptera, in social Hymenoptera. And that's a place where they get their proteins, essentially, where they make up for the lack of nutrients that they only find in sap and fruit. But this hornet juice stuff is actually kind of interesting. It has been ascribed to increases in human athletic performance, and you can in fact buy a synthetic mixture of hornet juice and use that to make your running better or something like that. So, but again, foraging for carbohydrates for themselves, foraging for other insects or meat sources for the larvae, and then engaging in trophallaxis to ensure that they get their nutritional needs met as workers. Predation behaviors are actually, kind of what you would expect. They fly around and look for a thing that they can eat, something that they can catch. So some insects are going to be far too small, some will be too fast. I don't know that there are any that are actually too big, because what the hornets do, and they have incredibly strong mandibles. You can look at how wide the cheek is in this head. That is just packed full of muscles that control these these strong mandibles. Sorry, for some water, and sharp mandibles. Essentially, they will catch an insect. They will bite off the bits that they don't want. So they usually eliminate the head and the wings and the abdomen and just return with a mashed up thorax, which we call a food pellet or a meatball. So kind of the filet mignon of an insect, just the nice muscular bits. And they return those to the nest. This species will also do a thing. So these predation behaviors I'm describing right now were characterized by a Japanese scientist who described this hunting ethology. The hunting phase is the individual hunting. The slaughter phase are these special group attacks that occur in this species in Vespis roar. Again, that happens late in the season, and when it happens, essentially a hornet maybe visits a hive or a nest that she's been preying on for quite a while. But this time, instead of grabbing a bee or a wasp and returning it to her nest, she marks it with a pheromone, and that recruits her sisters, and they will come and they attack as a group. The attack is pretty frenzied. You'll read it in the literature as they behead all the bees and throw them on the ground, which sounds very horrible. But in fact, what they do is they just disable the bees. That often doesn't mean that they capture them and behead them. It also means that they just bite their thorax in half or chop the animals in half. They're not really beheading the bees. But it's important to note they do not actually capture any of the bees and use them as a food source during these group attacks. They simply eliminate the defense of that hive or that nest. The hornets will get so involved in this that they will die. They will run out of energy and simply die mid-attack. They also have a lot of trophallaxis between each other, where maybe a hornet that's that has a little bit more sustenance will be antennated by one of her sisters, and then she'll cough up some fluid to give that sister energy. And they essentially do this until that hive or nest no longer has enough animals to mount a defense. They don't necessarily kill them all, but they eliminate it so much that its group behavior, its defensive group behavior, becomes moot. And then they will occupy that hive or nest. And they wander around, pull out pupae and larvae. So if you think about them as like the shrimp of the nest, they are completely defenseless. They're full of muscle and fat, and it's relatively choice for the insect world, and then return them to their own nest to feed them to their own larvae. This is actually probably why people got as worked up about the giant hornet in North America as we did. It can be a very serious pest for beekeepers. 20 hornets can destroy a beehive in just a few hours. And in fact, the average time to kill a hive in Japan that's been recorded in the literature is about as long as a soccer game. So imagine you're a beekeeper, you go out, you look at your hive, you have a good brood pattern, there's no mites, the bees are happy, they're making honey, you dust your hands off and go have coffee, and you come back to a beehive full of giant stinging insects instead of your cute little bees. It could be a very significant pest, and beekeepers in places where these are endemic spend a lot of time protecting their hives from giant hornets. The bees, I should say, aren't completely defenseless. In fact, these are sort of the two main species of honeybee that we work with as humans, that we domesticate as humans: Apis cerana, the Asian or Eastern honeybee, and Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee. Apis mellifera is what we have in North America. Apis cerana is really restricted to its native range, Asia, where it's co-evolved with the hornet. So it has actually a lot of behaviors to protect itself from these attacks. One of them we see in a lot of bees, these shimmering or bee waves, where they will come outside the hive and wave their wings around, and it's thought to break up the visual cues that the hornets are able to use to orient on a hive to attack. An amazing behavior that had been discovered in Japan and then really confirmed in Vietnam. Some researchers from Guelph and Wellesley. That's right. Actually, I'm not sure. Heather Matilla and Gard Otis did this work in Vietnam, and they found that that the Apis cerana can actually sense the pheromones that the hornets mark the hives with, and they will cover that with plant resins or animal feces, thus obscuring that pheromone signal and making it difficult or impossible for the hornets to relocate the nest and have a group attack. And then the one that everybody got really excited about, and you've probably seen it on nature shows, are these bee balls. Apis cerana is a fairly savvy defender of its hive. When they sense a hornet there, they will sort of pull out of the way, let the hornet worker come on in the hive, and then they will rush it as a mass, all start biting it and stinging it. They also starve it of oxygen by essentially flooding with carbon dioxide and raising the temperature to just above the lethal point for the hornet. So it's really effective behavior. Apis mellifera has the following defenses. That's right. They did not evolve with the hornets, so they essentially have nothing useful to offer. They will attack hornets, and they do in fact kill them. We found some hornets that were killed by Western honeybees in Washington State, but they have nowhere near the suite of defensive capabilities that Apis cerana does. In fact, Matsura and Sakagami essentially made fun of how pathetic the European bees were, and you just end up with this instead. There is also a human health aspect to it, to giant hornets, because they're stinging Hymenoptera. It's basically the same as other Hymenoptera, but worse because they're bigger. The main risk, of course, is if you are allergic, and that is what most deaths of this, and of course all stinging Hymenoptera across the world occur from. But because the insect is so large, this is slightly out of order. Anyway, you should know that Mandarinia is not aggressive. They're just very, very defensive, and they will defend a nest. They will sting you if you pick them up. I know this for a fact. And then once they occupy a hive, they will actually defend that as well. So they will sting that poor beekeeper that comes out to find he has no more bees. Let's see. You can have mass attacks. There have been years where the hornet population is so big that people just stumble into these nests and they can't get away. And you get stung enough and have so much venom delivered to you that you are crippled and rarely killed. But it turns out the deaths from this hornet are not actually that much different from any other stinging Hymenoptera. So they're not especially problematic from a mortality perspective, but they're horrible to be stung by. And then usually it's pain. So here's an example of some of the things that can happen. This is a sort of cytolytic damage that happens from hornet stings. You can actually get this from yellow jackets as well. Maybe you've had a little lenticular piece of your flesh die. The difference here is that they're big, and so you get a lot more venom, and so a larger cytolytic impact. And here's actually Conrad Berube from Victoria Island was stung through his clothes, and you can see that these stingers are large enough that they actually draw blood, a significant amount of blood. So big animals. Okay, so that's sort of the general thing. We have a single year social hymenoptera. They're predators. Their reproductive cycle is really pushed to the end of their colony cycle. That is the most sensitive part of the colony to attack from an eradication perspective. They are a bee pest. They're apex predators, and they hurt humans when they sting them. I'm going to pivot now to the story about Vespa mandarinia Cascadia, or the part of British Columbia in the Pacific Northwest that nestles up against the Puget Sound and the Straits of Georgia. The story really begins in 2019 when there were several hornet sightings in Vancouver, essentially. Vespa soror, that sister species, the southern giant hornet, was found in Vancouver in 2019. It made the social media rounds, made its way to the provincial apiarist and to CFIA, I think, and they were basically able to identify it and say, not a big deal. Hornets show up sometimes, and as we've just learned from the life cycle, a worker hornet does not a established population make. But it caught our attention because it's rare that a live hornet actually makes it all the way across the ocean. This one was flying around sort of near the port areas. In 2019, in August, so that was in May. In August, actually, several northern giant hornets, the Vespa mandarinia, were sighted on Vancouver Island in Nanaimo. Beekeepers were seeing them hawking at their hives. So hawking is this behavior where you hang out by the hive and try to capture a bee, hunting at their hives. And a group of beekeepers got together and sort of triangulated the sightings that they had and figured out it must be in this forest park. They wandered into the forest park and almost immediately found the nest. You can watch this diverting YouTube video. It's very dramatic. Has a lot of happened all at night. Has a lot of like fog and stuff from carbon dioxide. You can see people get stung and see what that's like if you're not making a big deal out of it. But the upshot is they destroyed that nest in September 2019, which was awesome. They captured it and excavated, and there was no evidence of reproductive success. No gines had been reproduced, had been produced or emerged. I don't think there were any males that had emerged, and that would count as a really successful eradication event from the perspective of this animal's life cycle. So breathing easy, I suppose, but then in December of 2019 in Blaine, Washington, which is quite far from Nanaimo and on the mainland, somebody found a giant hornet on their porch, reported it to our state invasive species council, which then made its way to us, the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And we found another specimen down the road the same year. A photograph was made in White Rock, BC, so just across the border. And then we started hearing about hive kills. Beehives obviously die all the time, but it is rare that it dies suddenly and with a giant pile of beheaded bees and no honey stores removed. So good evidence that the hornets had engaged in this predation behavior. And in the spring, we discovered 3 queens. So obviously some nests somewhere had been successful. Queen curled up on somebody's porch. So this is what the landscape sort of looked like in 2019, 2020 in terms of hornet sightings. We had a nest that had been located and destroyed in Canada. Oh, wait, here we go. In Canada. We had some suspicious beehive kills. This person actually was stung by something that came out of his beehive and he set it on fire, so we never got to really investigate it. Some sightings and some sightings again in 2020, and really covering kind of a broad area. So alarming and not a thing we wanted to let get by. So we began our survey, and our survey approach was pretty straightforward. We learned a lot from the invasion of yellow hornet in Europe and Korea. And basically it involves finding the hornets, finding out where their nests are, and destroying the nests before they can produce queens and males. So our goal was to locate hornets. Once we locate them, somehow collect them and track them back to their nest. And we'll get into that. Once we successfully track the hornet to the nest, then we simply remove it. Easy peasy, right? No rodenticide, no helicopters. Our main strategy, it was just going to be bottle traps. There is not a commercial lure, a pheromone lure, or other semiochemical that works especially well for Vespa. And so we defaulted to what people use in its native range, which are bottle traps, essentially some sort of trap that the hornet can get into. You can see like a little entry hole right here. The trap is baited with those carbohydrates that they like, a mixture of juice and ethanol, typically, because that It gives off the kind of volatiles that a piece of fruit might have, and then it serves both as an attractant and a killing solution. And the drawback is that it also kills and attracts many, many other things. So by the end of the season, these were just giant hamburgers full of fruit flies, for instance. But whatever, it's what we had to work with. So essentially, our approach was to hang the grossest mimosa you could imagine in a tree, rice wine and orange juice, and then check those weekly. About 1,000 traps WSDA installed in 2020, a little bit more in 2021. We were shooting for a trap density of 1 every square kilometer in the area defined by where the sightings were recorded. We also had some experimental traps trying to test various lures that was run by USDA ARS in particular, and Sterling International, a company that specializes in yellow jacket traps, had sent us some things to try as well, hoping that we could find maybe something better than mimosas. And then, of course, we had live traps. They're simply the same, that ethanol juice bait that we would hang in an area once we had evidence that hornets were active, but they had a screen to prevent the hornets from drowning, so we could pull them out and track them back to their nest. That was our agency approach. We also recruited thousands of community science and collaborating agencies to do the same thing. Basically, got people excited, said, "Hey, hang a trap in your yard and let us know what you find." And that was important, especially at the beginning, because funding was slow to arrive, and we didn't think we had enough to get the coverage we wanted, and the public was all over it. Partially because I think people are afraid of stinging insects, and partially because this was COVID and there were lots and lots of people, particularly in Washington State, that were locked down and had nothing to do and were bored out of their minds. People really got into it. People would name their traps: Herbie the Love Hornet, Chitty Chitty, Sting Sting. That person had a different theme every week. We actually asked the public to send us their contents if they could, or let us pick them up, because we wanted to verify that our trapping program wasn't in fact killing all the bees that we were presumably trying to save with our approach. And we ended up hiring a full-time outreach personnel who distributed supplies to the public, primarily to collaborators and sometimes to community groups. And then we also tried to come up with ways that the public could source supplies on their own. She handled like the outreach, the training, and arranging to have things picked up. And we also tried to get people to only focus in Western Washington. Climate modeling suggests that the dry interior was not good habitat, so we weren't worried about it there. So that's sort of what that looked like in 2020. This is our Bellingham area grids. There's White Rock, Vancouver's. Sorry, I'm like totally using my cursor on the wrong screen. Here's White Rock, Vancouver's up this way. Here's our traps, shooting for 1 per square kilometer, some random traps out here to follow up on potential sightings and community science. And we also knew that outreach was going to be a huge deal, both for Washington State Department of Agriculture and for British Columbia. The public who alerted us to these in the first place. We knew that we had a trapping approach that worked well for community science participants. And so we leaned hard into outreach, maybe more so than we would for some other kind of eradication programs. We started with pest alerts, both the province, British Columbia, and Washington State Department of Agriculture. We created a blog that got a lot of traffic pretty early on, and developed a communications plan. So a real deliberate attempt to utilize all of our options. That included invasive species pages, both by BC Ministry of Agriculture and by us. A Facebook group, which was like people could recruit themselves to the Facebook group, and there was like lots of room for discussion and sharing information, trying to mitigate some of the myths about the insect and the approach. We got our very own website, which is pretty hard to do at the government level. Normally, you have to like cycle through 12 different tabs before you get to what you're looking for. We got one right at the end of the thing. That was great. A listserv and a pest program hotline, and an online reporting site where people could actually post pictures of suspect hornets and tell us where they were. We were feeling pretty good about it. It was really organized, and we lost a slide here. So this slide actually then shows an article that was published in the New York Times in May 2nd, which I remember Mike Baker, the author and regional editor, sent it to me, and I thought, that's funny. It's where the name murder hornet sort of first popped into our parlance. I thought it was a silly name, but that's fine. And I thought maybe now some more people would know about what we were doing. But after that, like the phones just started ringing like crazy. We captured, America's heart with murder hornets. So, for example, our giant hornet webpage went from about 4,300 total views in 5 months, which is pretty good for a WSDA webpage. I mean, that's up there, to 76,000 views in about a week. So an enormous amount of web page traffic. Our public reporting website, where people could give us reports, went from 170 over several months to three times that in 1 week. And it just kept growing, and it started reaching people far outside of Washington and British Columbia. Let's see. And both the name and how bored people were must have driven this interest, because there actually already been a New York Times article and it didn't get nearly as much traffic. And actually for a whole week we did nothing but talk to the media. Paul in British Columbia and people throughout our agency and federal partners talked to basically every news organization you can imagine in Europe, in Asia, and across North America. Whatever. Let's see. And just there we go. I was going to make a point. If you search for Asian giant hornet on May 6th, so that was sort of the old sort of common name that wasn't established or officially recognized, but commonly used, you would get about 148,000 hits. If you search for murder hornet that same day, you got 1.8 million hits. So there's a lot in the name. Okay. So talk about let's see. That's lame. Why that happened. So this was a map that just showed there was a ton of sightings submitted globally, including from Switzerland, about 4,400 submitted from Washington, British Columbia, and only 20 of these were actually giant hornets. So, people were seeing lots of other things, almost all of which were not giant hornets, but they didn't do too badly. Like the majority of these animals actually look a bit like a giant hornet. They're orange and black, and they're big. They're almost all native. And it was easy for us to go through all of those sightings, but a sort of a low return on the volume, but it was okay. So here's some of the kinds of things people would submit. Like this is actually dog vomit, and I think the person saw the stripes from grass and thought, well, that's hornet-like. This is a caterpillar, that's a bumblebee, some like stink bug relatives, but in this case, because they have stripes, I think that alerted people. We will never know what this thing is in the greats. I'm not sure at all. People were very brave. This guy was sure that was a giant hornet. It was in fact a completely harmless horntail sawfly, so a wood-boring sawfly. But he muscled through his fear long enough to get a photograph on it. And having had one of these crawl on you, I can tell you that is alarming. We also had to start dealing with some interesting things we didn't anticipate. So people would often submit pictures that were clearly of giant hornets, but they weren't pictures they'd taken. They were something they'd gotten off the internet, sometimes from our own outreach. So there was a lot of vetting of the things we got to verify whether it was an original image or not. Sometimes we get pictures that clearly were a giant hornet, and then nobody would tell us where it was afterwards. So not so helpful. But for all of that, we ended up some really solid leads that first year. Here's a doorbell cam of a hornet attracted to somebody, harvesting pears. Which is part of a bevy of sightings that led us to a place where we captured. All right, can you see a hornet walking about with a tag?
Yep.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. All right, so that video and several other sightings finally led us to a place where there was clearly a cluster. We were able to net a hornet. I netted a hornet in somebody's yard. That landowner netted a hornet later in their yard. We caught some in live traps, and after several failed attempts to attach a tag to the hornet and have them fly, like the first hornet just flew away and we never saw it again. The second one just laid in the grass and refused to do anything. We finally tagged several hornets. They spent about an hour hanging out in trees, not being very useful, but eventually we were able to track them through the woods. All these people behind us are a film crew. It does not take this many entomologists to follow a giant hornet and locate a nest, which turned out to be in a tree, quite high, so not what we were expecting based on what we thought we knew about its biology. And again, it doesn't take this many biologists to kill a giant hornet nest. These are more film crew people. We got these sort of protective suits from China. We were all quite paranoid about being stung. And I think on British TV, they described this as a group of bleached minions, like from that cartoon. So kind of funny. Effective, hard to move around in. And we captured a nest, and it was great. Very successful. We were able to learn a lot from the nest, including sequencing its frass to find out what they were eating. They're getting on Uber Bug Eats. But you'll notice that there were lots and lots of new gines that had already emerged that were in the nest that had already been emerging as we were taking the nest down, including some that were in the landowner's dog bowl. So we essentially got that nest too late. We failed in our attempt to break the reproductive cycle. No big deal. All right, so 2020 we had 34 confirmed hornet sightings and that one nest, which is buried up here in the next to the border. 2021, we just did the same thing again. We expanded our grid farther east in for the WSDA traps. The community science traps constrained a little bit. They tightened up and became more focused on the place we were interested in. And the end of the season was essentially the same: 11 confirmed hornets and 3 nests. This time, they were all captured, again, all in trees, which is very peculiar, but they were all captured well before the production of reproductives. So no queens in them whatsoever, no males in them whatsoever, except for one nest that had a lot of diploid males, which is a sign of inbreeding. It has nothing to do with the reproductive cycle. And so quite a successful year. And essentially we did exactly the same for the next 3 years, 22, 23, and 24. We sort of arbitrarily established that a 3-year absence of hornet sightings using a program that we trusted and believed in would be evidence of eradication. And the public continued to be deeply involved in this. And we found no more hornets. And so USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, declared it eradicated a few years later. So here we are in one of our hornet suits. And I didn't even tell you about this. The way we removed the nest actually was by vacuuming them up. We did have a pesticide, essentially a powdered pyrethrin available, which is commonly used to remove hornet or social hymenoptera nests. But we didn't really want to use it, partly because there's paperwork involved, and partly because we wanted the freedom to learn as much about the insects as possible. And I was not keen on having to wait through a pesticide if I didn't have to. And so instead, we learned how to vacuum up hornets from a person that collects yellow jackets live for to create anti-allergens, and it turned out to be highly effective. We collected them into these tubes so we could see, that they were all in there. That very first night we had that tube and we took them back and thought they were all dead, so I was counting them and it turned out they were alive. So I hurriedly put them back into the tube, but there were no hiccups after that. So yeah, there we go. We were able to do this basically through a lot of work. It took a fairly large crew of field trappers, so people that had to check these traps every single week. We checked them weekly, partially because they got so gross, partially because they filled up with so much bycatch that they would become ineffective. In fact, that first nest that we found, one of our experimental traps, a hornet had simply walked right back out because there were so many fruit flies in it that it didn't drown. And then they also were the ones that had to look for the hornets. We wanted to be able to act as quickly as possible to try and find nests before they completed their reproductive cycle. It took a lot of grant and contract administrators, both to administer contracts made from our agency to other people and to handle the money coming in from the federal government, which and the state government, a couple of different funding sources. Communication experts were critical to this, communications and outreach. I think it really made a huge difference, partially from the community trapping, but partially because it laid the groundwork for us to be able to tromp around in a community that isn't necessarily that could be very suspicious of government workers, and people really understood what we were doing and were supportive of it. And so we were able to access all of our trapping sites without upsetting landowners or having any conflict or very little conflict. And then they also kept the sightings coming in, and that was important. We ended up actually getting sightings from far away from the area. We followed up on them. They were dead hornets that had shown up in packages and things like this, but that net spread very far from the actual area that we were working in, including, and so a volunteer coordinator was another aspect of that, making sure that the people that were doing this work with us had their needs met, they were heard, they were engaged, and it's really important to let them know that their efforts were critical. Researchers and federal collaborators. The research on this insect is actually surprisingly underdeveloped, and that makes a lot of sense. Often we don't know much about a species that is of interest in an invasion or introduction perspective because it's never been that big of a problem in its native range. You don't need to know how many degree days it takes for it to emerge from a nest, for instance, if it's just fine. Like, you don't have to worry about it. So researchers all over the planet really started helping and really beginning to build some of the knowledge. And in fact, we have an entire research program that emerged from this, the results of which are just starting to be finalized and published. And yeah, there we go. And Washington residents. And I actually have Washington residents, and I am remiss. I should have invasives Canada. Actually, British Columbia residents did the exact same effort, and were in fact the bulwark of the efforts in British Columbia. There was not a federal program really in BC to address this. There was a provincial program with very limited funds, and so we relied heavily on volunteers right across the border to bolster this effort. Because the hornets don't care; they'll fly right across. And yeah, and so with that, there's just hundreds and hundreds of people to thank. Um, that includes again researchers, community members, whatever. But I do want to highlight in particular these people. Oops, sorry, let's on to a different presentation. The people right here: the Bovenkamp, Shelton, De Jong, Pollender, Morn and Tompkins, Kreider, Rivek, Jordan, Rodenberg, Jolker, Beard, and Barrett families, all of whom let us access their properties, let us remove those nests. In some cases, caught hornets themselves. They were huge. They came in clutch for North America and their community. So that's looks like we've just about hit 10 o'clock. Did my oh no, just about hit 10 o'clock. I'm happy to answer any questions, revisit any slides, or I could talk for another hour about all of our research program.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. That was a really informative, really great talk. It was great to see all the collaboration that took place to tackle this issue. And I just wanted to say, I for one think you look pretty cool in those outfits there.
We have even better suits from Korea. They look more like hazmat suits than weird space suits, but yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, if anyone has questions, throw them in the chat. We have like about 5 minutes or so, but I have some questions for you, and I can
Please do.
pose some to you from some folks. We have a little bit of time here. I guess one of my questions was, do you know how they got to North America? It was maybe through the ports, some kind of shipment of.
Sorry. Yeah. The answer is we don't know actually. Traffic on port on international cargo seems to be the most likely explanation. It's sort of strange, like so those same things that made its life cycle, like the delayed reproductive status, the fact that the majority of them can't really contribute or instigate a new colony, uh, also makes it really peculiar that it was able to become established. So essentially, some overwintered mated queens had to show up in British Columbia and Washington, and cargo remains the most likely way. We did some molecular analysis, and it seems pretty clear that the Washington specimens originated in South Korea. Probably the Nanaimo specimens originated in Japan, although if you think about how population genetics can be nested, it's possible that I guess the distinction between Japan and South Korea maybe isn't as strong as we want. But it looks like we definitely had two different introduction events, and maybe from two different countries, probably from two different countries in the same year, which just is sort of baffling. But sorry, yeah, we don't know. Cargo is the most likely pathway. As I said, we had people start contacting us. It turns out dead hornets show up in packages and cars more often than you would think. So perhaps a live hornet showing up is just a matter of time.
Okay, that's good to know, and something to keep an eye on going forward. Let's see. I know, yeah, it was sad to see that some of the honeybees that we have here have zero defense against northern hornets. Are there some species of bees that are more susceptible to predation, like honeybees versus some of our native bees?
So we were able to do an analysis of what the hornets were feeding on by actually taking the poop. So in this animal, when the larvae are finishing their life cycle, they sort of evacuate all the stuff. They evacuate their feces, one big chunk of frass. They call it a meconium, just like we would for a human baby. And we were able to sequence the DNA from that and come up with what the hornets were eating. And they ate a lot of honeybees in North America, a lot of honeybees, a lot of paper wasps, and a lot of yellow jackets. So the main paper wasp they fed on is actually also an introduced species, the Palouse dominula, the European paper wasp. They did feed on our native species, which is now quite rare because it's been displaced by Palouse dominula. Um, the yellow jackets, their native yellow jackets, they fed on them, with wild abandon. But in terms of other bees, hardly anything. There was a bumblebee or two that showed up and a megachilid that showed up. It seems like those animals just really aren't on the hornet's hunting radar. That they're in different places, their life cycle doesn't quite match up. We've actually since sequenced feces from Korean nests, and we're just finishing a manuscript that compares them, and we found the same thing. Like other bees are really not attacked. It's apis, and then another wasps.
Awesome. Let's see. Someone do you have an estimate of overall cost of this whole eradication effort?
It was a little over, if we think of just the eradication efforts, it was a little over $1 million US for each of the years. Most of that was getting people into the field. So just buying cars, having 8 trappers on staff, doing this weekly. A chunk of that, as it actually was for the eradication. And so, for instance, for the last couple of years, we haven't needed to use that money. And so it became carry forward to enhance our survey. And in fact, we're doing another survey this year based on a dead hornet that was found. But yeah, 1 million and some change for US dollars for every year. And that doesn't count the money that has been devoted to research, which is less, but only exists because of the interest in this as an eradication target. So
Awesome.
quite expensive.
Yeah. But, less money than they would have costed if they went rampant on our honeybees.
That's right. That's the presumption. The management cost
Let's
of
see.
always higher than the eradication cost. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's see here. I think we'll do maybe one more question. Do you think the lessons learned and novel solutions from the success of this program could be applied to other invasive insects?
The answer is yes, but with caution. So for this one, I said we were fortunate in aspects of its biology, like that late reproductive cycle. We can focus on targeting the nests before they emerge. The other one is that it's really big and easy to recognize. We have been able to have a few. So if we think about the role that community detections played in this, and I know invasives Canada, like we all have all kinds of outreach for all sorts of invasive species, spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borer, these giant hornets. Some of those are more successful than others because the animals are more recognizable than others. In this case, it was awesome, and so we could easily screen those 7,000 reports in one year. So the lesson is, yeah, lean hard on your outreach and recruiting the public, but do it for things like this. Maybe don't do it for bark beetles, right? Which all just look like mouse turds, and every bark beetle looks the same, even to highly trained entomologists. So that's one lesson. Recruit the public, but do it smart and with the animals that it makes sense. Um, and and actually, I would. This is kind of being done right now in Georgia. The yellow-legged hornet. That was part of the name for part of the reason for settling on a very specific name, northern giant hornet, was at this time the Asian giant hornet was showing up here. There's another species that was invading Europe called the Asian hornet in English, or Frelon asiatique in French, and Asiatische Hornissa, whatever, like just called the Asian hornet in all these other languages. And it was hopelessly confusing. We, in fact, might have found that first nest in 2020, about a month and a half earlier, except the person that got the early hornet there had reported it to the Asian hornet webpage, not the Asian giant hornet webpage. So hopelessly confusing. Anyway, the yellow-legged hornet, which is what we now call that one, is invading in Georgia and South Carolina. And again, public calling and reports has been a huge part of their eradication success. I mean, their success so far. Like many of the nests they find come from the public. They were not. I don't think they were able to use the same tracking technology we did as successfully. The tracking stuff's pretty finicky, and those tags are relatively heavy for hornets. The giant
Yeah.
hornet can go around no problem. The yellow-legged hornet is smaller, and so they've used other approaches to track back to the nest. But it's the same overall strategy. And then we're going to be working in Guam this summer on Vespa tropica, which is another enormous hornet that is spread across the island very rapidly there. It seems to be mostly feeding on introduced paper wasps, but also has become a big problem for beekeepers um, and homeowners, people just getting stung. And so we'll be working with them to see how much of this tracking technology is usable and can that be taught to, say, for instance, biologists in the Northern Mariana Islands and Hawaii as a way to react quickly to any perceived incursions. I cannot believe I'm using all this martial language, but whatever. Any early detections? How about that?
Yeah, those trackers definitely seemed useful, but I couldn't see those being put on a lot of invasive insects. They were pretty big just compared to the giant hornet.
Yeah,
Um,
0.16 grams. We tried them out first on bald-faced hornets, which is not a hornet. It's Dolica vescula maculata, our sort of largest native yellow jacket. And they just immediately went to the ground and kind of clambered about.
I've seen videos of them tying with tags and then just visually following the
Mm-hmm.
hornets back to the nest.
We tried that as well. In our case, there was so much private land in the part of the area we were working. It became really problematic to see if we could, like, we couldn't just run across somebody's field, following a streamer on an animal. And then there was also a lot of dense forest. All of these were deep in forests. Well, three of the four were deep in forest. One of them was like in a weird cow pasture. But same thing. You just immediately lose sight, and then you're wandering around in the woods, which we did lots of to no effect. So the tags ended up being a lifesaver.
That makes sense. Okay, I think we'll end it there. We're missing a couple questions, but we don't want to go over too much. Chris, thanks so much for presenting with us today. Really great presentation, and so happy that there's a big win for invasive species work here in the last few years, and
Yeah,
hoping your neck of the woods stays clear of northern giant hornets going forward.
yeah. We're working on all kinds of other things instead. So yes, no more hornets, please.